the blood-curdling screams echoing through the walls of the Davidson estate on that fateful spring morning of 1875 were not those of celebration, but of shame and heartbreak, as Lillian Davidson, once the pride of Silver Creek, Colorado, brought forth her child into a world that had already rejected them both. "Get out! You have disgraced this family for the last time," thundered Harold Davidson, his face contorted with rage as he towered over his daughter's bed, where she lay exhausted from childbirth, her newborn daughter cradled against her chest. The morning light filtering through the lace curtains did nothing to soften his hardened features or the cold determination in his eyes. "Father, please," Lillian begged, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. At 22, she had once been the belle of Silver Creek, with her honey-blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Now, those same eyes brimmed with tears as she clutched her infant daughter tighter. "The baby needs shelter. It's still cold outside." "You should have thought of that before you allowed yourself to be ruined by that traveling salesman," her mother, Eleanor, hissed from the doorway, unable to even look at the infant. "A man who couldn't even stay long enough to give his child a name." Lillian flinched at the reminder of Thomas, the smooth-talking man who had promised her the world and disappeared at the first mention of her pregnancy. "Mother, she's your granddaughter." "I have no granddaughter," Eleanor replied coldly. "And as of today, I have no daughter." Harold threw a carpetbag onto the bed. "Pack your things. You have until sundown to be off our property." The door slammed behind her parents, leaving Lillian alone with her newborn daughter and the crushing weight of her new reality. She named the child Emma that day, after her grandmother who had shown her the only unconditional love she had ever known in the Davidson household. By sunset, Lillian had gathered what few possessions she could carry: some clothes, a silver hairbrush that had been a gift from her grandmother, a small amount of money she had saved, and a locket containing a curl of Emma's dark hair. With her daughter bundled against the spring chill, she stood at the edge of the Davidson property, the grand house that had been her home for all her life now forbidden to her. "I promise you, Emma," she whispered to the sleeping infant, "somehow we will find our place in this world." Silver Creek was a small town, and news traveled fast. By morning, every door was closed to the fallen daughter of Harold Davidson. The church that had once welcomed her now suggested she move on to the next town. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The only assistance came from Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly widow who ran the general store, who slipped Lillian some extra supplies and directions to a hunting cabin that belonged to her late husband, some 5 miles outside of town. "It ain't much," Mrs. Abernathy had said, "but it'll keep you and the little one from the elements while you figure things out." The cabin was indeed not much: a single room with a small fireplace, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed with a thin mattress. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the windows were drafty, but it was shelter. For 2 weeks, Lillian made do, gathering wild berries and plants she recognized from her mother's garden, hunting small game with an old rifle Mrs. Abernathy had included with the cabin's key, and caring for Emma, who grew stronger each day despite their circumstances. It was on a particularly cold morning when Emma was just over 3 weeks old that Lillian's already precarious situation took a turn for the worse. A late spring storm had rolled in overnight, bringing freezing rain that had soaked through the leaky roof and drenched their bed. Emma was feverish and fussy, and the firewood was almost gone. Desperate, Lillian bundled Emma against her chest and ventured out into the storm, heading toward town. She would beg if she had to, appeal to whatever humanity remained in the townspeople she had once called friends and neighbors. She couldn't let her daughter die because of her mistakes. The journey was treacherous, the path muddy and slick from the rain. Halfway to town, Lillian slipped on a particularly steep section, tumbling down a small embankment. She managed to protect Emma from the worst of the fall, but landed hard on her ankle, a sharp pain shooting up her leg as she tried to stand. "Help!" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "Please, someone help us!" But there was no one to hear her cries on the desolate trail. Fighting back tears of pain and desperation, Lillian crawled back up to the path, Emma wailing now from cold and hunger. With her ankle throbbing, she knew she couldn't make it to town, but turning back meant certain death for both of them as the temperature continued to drop. It was then that she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out the silhouette of a rider, tall and broad-shouldered on a powerful black stallion. "Help!" she called again, waving one arm frantically while holding Emma close with the other. "Please, we need help." The rider slowed his horse and approached cautiously. As he came closer, Lillian could see he was a stranger to her, a man with a weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky, dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, and the most piercing gray eyes she had ever seen. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy: denim pants, a flannel shirt under a well-worn leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that was currently shedding water in rivulets. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and gravelly as he tipped his hat, "looks like you're in a spot of trouble." "My daughter," Lillian gasped, her voice breaking. "She's sick, and I've hurt my ankle. We need to get to town." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his considerable height. He knelt beside Lillian, his expression grave as he took in her pale face and the tiny bundle in her arms. Without hesitation, he removed his oilskin coat and wrapped it around Lillian and Emma. "Town's still a fair piece away, and this storm ain't letting up," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "My place is just over that ridge. Let's get you both out of this weather first." Before Lillian could respond, he had scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, carefully settling her and Emma in front of him on the saddle before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, providing both support and warmth. "I'm Isaac Zimmerman," he said as the horse began to move, picking its way carefully along the muddy path. "Most folks just call me Zim." "Lillian Davidson," she replied, then added with a touch of bitterness, "though I suspect you've heard of me already." "Can't say that I have," he responded easily. "Only been in these parts a couple of months." The relief that flooded through Lillian at those words was almost overwhelming. For once, someone was looking at her without judgment, without the weight of her sins reflecting back at her. Isaac's place turned out to be a modest but sturdy cabin built against the side of a hill, offering some protection from the wind. Unlike the hunting cabin where Lillian had been staying, this one was well maintained, with a solid roof and tight windows. A small barn stood nearby, where Isaac led his horse after helping Lillian inside. The interior was simple but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area beside it. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs sat in the center, and a bed was tucked into one corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and supplies. It was clearly the home of a man who lived alone but knew how to care for himself. Isaac quickly built up the fire while Lillian sat in a rocking chair he'd pulled close to the hearth, Emma still fussing weakly in her arms. "Let me have a look at that ankle," he said once the fire was blazing, kneeling beside her chair. His hands were large but gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Sprained, not broken," he pronounced after a moment, "but you won't be walking on it for a few days." Emma let out a pitiful cry, drawing his attention. "And the little one, she has a fever," Lillian said worriedly, touching Emma's flushed cheek. "And I haven't been able to feed her properly. My milk is drying up because I haven't had enough to eat myself." Instead of the disgust or embarrassment she expected at such a personal admission, Isaac merely nodded and rose to his feet. "I've got some goat's milk in the cellar. It might help for now. And I think I have some willow bark tea that should bring down her fever." As he moved around the cabin, gathering supplies with efficient movements, Lillian studied him openly. He was older than her, perhaps in his early 30s, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. But there was something else about him, a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance, a carefulness in how he handled things, as if he was always mindful of his own strength. Isaac warmed the goat's milk and showed Lillian how to feed Emma using a clean cloth dipped into the liquid. The baby suckled eagerly at the cloth, some color returning to her tiny face as she took in the nourishment. "You have experience with babies?" Lillian asked, surprised by his competence. A shadow crossed his face. "My sister had 3 little ones. I helped when I could." There was something in the way he used the past tense that made Lillian not press further. Instead, she accepted the bowl of stew he offered her, the rich aroma making her stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "Eat," he encouraged. "You need your strength." The stew was simple but hearty, filled with chunks of venison, potatoes, and carrots. Lillian couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal, and she had to force herself to eat slowly. As the storm raged outside, Isaac made up a pallet for Lillian and Emma near the fire, using his own bedding. Despite her protests, he insisted on taking the floor on the other side of the room. "Rest now," he said, his deep voice somehow soothing. "You're safe here." And for the first time since Emma's birth, Lillian felt that maybe, just maybe, that was true. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, keeping them confined to the cabin. Isaac proved to be a quiet but not unfriendly host. He tended to Emma alongside Lillian, his large hands surprisingly deft when changing the infant's makeshift cloth diapers or walking her around the cabin when she was fussy. "You said you've only been here a couple of months," Lillian ventured as they sat at the table, sharing a breakfast of biscuits and coffee on the second morning. "Where were you before?" Isaac took a moment before answering, as if weighing his words. "All over, I suppose. Texas, Arizona Territory, New Mexico. I was with a cattle outfit for years, moving herds up from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. And now I'm looking to put down some roots. Bought this place from a fellow heading to California. Got a small herd of my own starting, about 50 head grazing in the valley beyond the ridge." Lillian nodded, glancing around the cabin. "It's a good place. Solid." "It needs a woman's touch," Isaac said, then seemed to catch himself, a faint flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "I mean, it's functional but not much else." The storm finally broke late that afternoon, leaving a washed, clean world behind. Lillian's ankle was still tender, but the swelling had gone down and Emma's fever had broken completely. The baby was more alert than she'd been in days, her blue eyes so like Lillian's own, tracking the movements of the tall cowboy as he moved around the cabin. "I should get back to the hunting cabin," Lillian said reluctantly as evening approached. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Isaac frowned, pausing in his task of cleaning his rifle. "That old Abernathy place, it's hardly fit for man nor beast, let alone a woman and baby." Lillian stiffened slightly. "I don't have many options, Mr. Zimmerman." "Zim," he corrected automatically, then set down the rifle and faced her fully. "Look, Miss Davidson, Lillian, please," he nodded. "Lillian, then. I don't mean to pry, but it's clear you're in a difficult situation. That cabin won't make it through another storm, and winter's not that far off. Stay here." She blinked at him, certain she had misheard. "Stay here with you. "I've got the space," he said, gesturing around the cabin. "And I could use the help. Ranching's not easy work to do alone." "But you don't even know me," Lillian protested. "You don't know what I've done, why I'm out here alone with a newborn." Isaac's gray eyes held hers steadily. "I know you're a mother doing her best for her child. That tells me all I need to know about your character." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. After weeks of judgment and condemnation, his simple acceptance was almost too much to bear. "The town would talk. They already think the worst of me." A small, wry smile curved his lips. "I've never much cared what people think. And I live far enough out that the town's opinions don't reach here unless I ride in for them." "I couldn't. I wouldn't expect." Lillian fumbled for words. "It's just a roof and walls, Lillian," Isaac said gently. "A place for you and Emma to be safe while you get on your feet. Nothing more, nothing less." The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't a man with ulterior motives or hidden agendas. This was simply a good man offering help to someone in need. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Isaac was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where the last light of day was fading. "Because someone once did the same for me, when I needed it most. And because that cabin's no place for a child to grow up." Lillian looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle, a drawer from Isaac's dresser, lined with one of his softest shirts. The thought of taking her back to the cold, leaky hunting cabin was unbearable. "All right," she said at last. "We'll stay. Just until I can find proper work and a place of our own." Isaac nodded, satisfaction evident in the relaxing of his shoulders. "That's settled then." And somehow, with those simple words, Isaac Zimmerman gave Lillian and Emma what they needed most: a place to call home, without a single question asked about the past that had led them to his door. The first few days of their new arrangement were awkward as they navigated the intimacy of sharing a living space. Isaac insisted Lillian take the bed while he continued to sleep on a pallet near the fireplace. He left early each morning to tend to his cattle and returned late in the afternoon, often bringing small gifts: wild strawberries he'd found growing along the creek, a rabbit for the stew pot, once even a length of soft blue calico he'd ridden all the way to town for. "Thought you might like to make something for yourself or the little one," he'd said gruffly, handing her the fabric as if it were nothing special, though Lillian knew it must have cost him precious dollars. Despite her initial reservations, Lillian found herself settling into a routine. While Isaac was out with the herd, she kept the cabin, cooking meals, mending clothes, and caring for Emma, who grew stronger and more content each day. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence, Emma cradled between them. Lillian learned that Isaac had been orphaned young and raised by an older sister who had later died of consumption, along with her husband and children, during a particularly harsh winter in Nebraska. He'd been a drifter after that, working cattle drives and taking odd jobs until he'd saved enough to buy his own land. "I was tired of having nothing and no one to call my own," he admitted one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson. "A man needs to build something that will outlast him." In turn, Lillian shared parts of her own story growing up as the only child of Silver Creek's wealthiest family, the suffocating expectations, and yes, eventually, her fall from grace with Thomas, the traveling salesman who had swept her off her feet with promises of a different life, only to disappear when she told him she was carrying his child. "I was a fool," she said bitterly. "I believed him when he said he loved me, when he promised to come back for me after he'd established himself in Denver." Isaac's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "You weren't a fool. You were young and hopeful." He was the fool for not recognizing the treasure he had. His words warmed something deep inside Lillian that had been cold for a long time. As spring melted into summer, Lillian began to venture beyond the cabin, exploring the beautiful land Isaac had purchased. It was 1,000 acres of mixed-terrain rolling grasslands perfect for grazing cattle, stands of pine and aspen that provided timber and shelter from the elements, and a clear, fast-running creek that never seemed to dry up, even in the hottest weather. "You chose well," she told Isaac one day as they walked along the creek, Emma sleeping in a sling Lillian had fashioned from one of Isaac's old shirts. "This land has everything you need." "Almost everything," he replied quietly, his gray eyes holding hers for a moment before he looked away, pointing out a family of deer drinking downstream. By midsummer, Lillian had transformed the cabin. Using skills she'd learned as a privileged daughter, but never truly appreciated until now, she had made curtains from the blue calico, planted a small vegetable garden near the kitchen door, and added feminine touches that softened the bachelor austerity of the place: wildflowers in mason jars, a patchwork quilt pieced together from scraps of fabric, and herbs hanging to dry from the rafters. Isaac never commented directly on the changes, but she often caught him looking around with a pleased expression, as if the cabin was finally becoming what he had envisioned when he purchased it. Their routine expanded as Lillian grew stronger. She began accompanying Isaac on short rides around the property, Emma securely strapped to her chest. Isaac taught her about cattle ranching, explaining his plans to expand the herd and eventually build a larger house on the ridge overlooking the valley. "The view from up there is something to see," he told her. "On clear days, you can see all the way to the mountains to the west." "I'd like to see it sometime," Lillian replied. The next day, Isaac saddled his horse after breakfast and held out his hand to her. "Today's as clear as they come. Perfect for seeing that view." The ride to the ridge was leisurely, Isaac keeping the horse at an easy walk for Emma's sake. The baby, now almost 4 months old, was alert and curious, her eyes wide as she took in the changing scenery. When they reached the top of the ridge, Isaac helped Lillian dismount and led her to the edge where the land fell away dramatically, revealing a breathtaking panorama of the valley below and the distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "Oh," Lillian breathed, the beauty before her almost overwhelming. "You were right. It's magnificent. I thought one day—" Isaac began, then hesitated, running a hand through his dark hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "I thought one day I might build a proper house here. Something sturdy, with glass windows and maybe even one of those fancy iron cookstoves they sell in town." Lillian could see it in her mind's eye, a ranch house with a wide porch facing the view, smoke curling from a stone chimney, children playing in the yard. The vision was so clear, so right, that it startled her with its intensity. "It would be perfect," she said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a shared vision, perhaps, or a hope neither was quite ready to voice. The moment was broken when Emma began to fuss, hungry after the morning's excursion. As Lillian settled on a sun-warmed rock to feed her, Isaac wandered a few paces away, giving her privacy while still staying close enough to ensure their safety. Watching him standing tall against the endless Colorado sky, Lillian felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the man himself, his quiet strength, his unwavering kindness, the way his rare smile transformed his serious face into something that made her breath catch. It was dangerous, this feeling. She had been wrong about a man before, with devastating consequences. Yet Isaac was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas had been all charm and empty promises, Isaac was substance and steadfast reliability. He never said anything he didn't mean, never promised anything he couldn't deliver, and he had never, not once in all the months they had lived under his roof, made her feel that she owed him anything for his kindness. That evening, as they sat at the table sharing a meal of fresh trout Isaac had caught in the creek, Emma sleeping soundly in her cradle, a proper one now, fashioned by Isaac's skilled hands from aspen wood, Lillian found herself studying his face in the golden lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the small scar above his right eyebrow that he'd told her came from being thrown from a horse as a young man. "You're staring, Lillian," he said without looking up from his plate, though there was amusement in his voice. She flushed, embarrassed at being caught. "I was just thinking how different my life is now from what I expected it to be." Isaac set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "Different better or different worse?" "Different. Truer," she said after a moment of reflection. "Back in Silver Creek, everything was about appearances, about what others thought. Out here, none of that matters. It's just the work, the land, and—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "and us." Isaac's expression was unreadable as he held her gaze across the table. "Does that trouble you, being out here away from town society?" "No," Lillian said firmly. "I've found more peace here in these past months than I ever knew in Silver Creek." "I'm glad," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "I've been meaning to ask, is there anything you need from town? I'm riding in tomorrow to get supplies." The abrupt change of subject left Lillian slightly off balance, but she recovered quickly. "Some flour if they have it, and perhaps some coffee. We're running low." Isaac nodded, rising to clear the table. As they worked side by side washing the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing, Lillian couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them, though she couldn't quite name what it was. The next day, Isaac left early for town, promising to be back before dark. Lillian spent the morning attending to her usual chores, feeding the chickens they had recently acquired, hanging laundry to dry in the summer breeze, weeding the vegetable garden that was now producing more than enough to feed them. It was mid-afternoon when she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple horses, which was unusual since Isaac typically rode alone. Setting aside the shirt she was mending, Lillian stepped outside, shading her eyes against the sun. Coming up the path toward the cabin were 3 riders, Isaac on his black stallion, and 2 strangers on matching bay horses. As they drew closer, Lillian's blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider beside Isaac, her father, Harold Davidson. Instinctively, she retreated a step toward the cabin door, her hand reaching for the latch. But Isaac had already seen her, and his expression, grim but resolute, told her that this confrontation had been planned. "Lillian," Isaac called as they approached the yard, "you have visitors." Gathering her courage, Lillian stepped forward, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance she didn't entirely feel. "Father, Mr. Wilson." The third man was her father's lawyer and business partner. Harold Davidson had aged in the months since she'd last seen him. His once robust frame seemed diminished, and new lines had carved themselves into his face. But his eyes were the same, cold and assessing, as they took in her simple dress, the cabin behind her, and finally, the baby carrier fashioned from a blanket where Emma napped in the shade of the porch. "So it's true," he said, his voice carrying across the yard as he dismounted. "You've been living here all this time, with him?" His gaze flicked dismissively to Isaac, who had also dismounted but remained standing by his horse, his expression neutral. "Yes," Lillian replied steadily. "Mr. Zimmerman was kind enough to offer us shelter when you cast us out." "And what has this kindness cost you?" her father asked, the implication clear in his sneering tone. Before Lillian could respond, Isaac stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying a steel edge that she had never heard before. "It has cost her nothing, Mr. Davidson. Your daughter and her child are guests in my home, nothing more." Harold's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You expect me to believe a man takes in a woman and her bastard child out of the goodness of his heart, without expecting compensation?" "I don't particularly care what you believe," Isaac replied evenly, "but you will not insult Lillian in my presence." The tension in the yard was palpable as the two men faced each other. Harold, once the most powerful man in Silver Creek, now diminished by age and bitterness, and Isaac, solid and unwavering as the mountains themselves. It was Mr. Wilson who broke the standoff, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should discuss the reason for our visit." Lillian looked between the men, confusion clear on her face. "What reason? I thought I made it clear months ago that I would not give up my child, no matter what you offered." Harold's jaw tightened. "Circumstances have changed." He gestured toward the cabin. "Shall we continue this inside, or do you prefer to air all your affairs in the open?" After a moment's hesitation, Lillian nodded stiffly and led the way into the cabin, retrieving Emma from her carrier as she passed. Isaac followed, positioning himself near the door as if preparing to defend the threshold if necessary. Once inside, Harold took in the modest but well-kept interior with a critical eye. "So this is where the daughter of Silver Creek's founding family has ended up. A one-room cabin in the wilderness." "A home," Lillian corrected quietly, settling into the rocking chair with Emma now awake in her arms. "Which is more than you offered us." Something flickered across her father's face, regret, perhaps, or simple discomfort. He exchanged a glance with Wilson, who pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "Your mother is dying, Lillian," Harold said abruptly. The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. Despite everything, Eleanor Davidson was still her mother, still the woman who had read her bedtime stories as a child and taught her to play the piano. What is it?" "Consumption," Wilson supplied when Harold remained silent. "The doctors give her a month, perhaps less." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't understand why you're telling me this now after all this time." "She's asking for you," Harold admitted, the words seemingly difficult for him to say. "She wants to see you and the child before she passes." Lillian looked down at Emma, now 5 months old and thriving, her dark curls a stark contrast to Lillian's blonde hair. "The child has a name, Emma, your granddaughter." Harold's mouth tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "Eleanor wishes to see you both and to make amends." "Amends?" Lillian repeated skeptically. "The last time I saw Mother, she told me I was dead to her." "People say things in anger and fear that they later regret," Wilson interjected smoothly. "Your mother has had time to reflect on her actions. And you, Father?" Lillian asked directly, meeting Harold's gaze. "Have you had time to reflect as well?" A muscle jumped in Harold's jaw. "I've come to fetch you, haven't I? That should tell you something." It was a non-answer, typical of her father, who had never been able to admit when he was wrong. But beneath the bluster, Lillian thought she detected a genuine concern, if not for her, then at least for her mother. "There's more," Wilson said, unfolding the document he held. "In light of Mrs. Davidson's condition, she has insisted on amending the family will. She wishes to ensure that you and Emma are provided for, regardless of future circumstances." Lillian's eyes widened in surprise. "She's including us in the will. After everything, there are conditions," Harold said quickly, his expression hardening once more. "You must return to Silver Creek immediately. You must resume your proper place in society as a Davidson. And—" He hesitated, his gaze sliding toward Isaac, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "You must end whatever Arrangement exists here. The implication was clear, and it sent a rush of indignation through Lillian. There is no arrangement to end, Father. Mr. Zimmerman has been a friend and nothing more. Then there should be no impediment to your return, Harold pressed. A house has been prepared for you, the old Milford place on Willow Street. It's small but respectable. You will have an allowance sufficient for your needs, and Emma will be acknowledged as a Davidson, with all the privileges that entails. It was more than Lillian had ever expected: a home of her own, financial security, a place in society for Emma. Yet the thought of leaving the cabin, of not seeing Isaac's face across the breakfast table each morning or hearing his deep voice reading aloud in the evenings, sent a physical pain through her chest. "I need time to consider," she said finally. Harold frowned. "Your mother doesn't have time, Lillian. We leave tomorrow morning. I expect you to be ready." Before Lillian could respond, Isaac finally spoke, his voice level but with an undercurrent of emotion she couldn't quite identify. "That's not how invitations work, Mr. Davidson. You don't get to command your daughter's presence after casting her out when she needed you most." Harold turned to face Isaac fully, his expression thunderous. "This is a family matter, Cowboy. It doesn't concern you." "Lillian and Emma have been living under my roof for months now," Isaac replied evenly. "That makes their welfare very much my concern." The two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. It was Wilson who again intervened, placing a restraining hand on Harold's arm. "Perhaps we should allow Miss Davidson some time to process this news," the lawyer suggested diplomatically. "We're staying at the Silver Horse Inn in town. We could return tomorrow afternoon for her answer." After a tense moment, Harold gave a curt nod. "Very well. Until tomorrow, then." He turned to Lillian, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Your mother truly is asking for you, Lily. Whatever you may think of me, don't punish her for my mistakes." The use of her childhood nickname struck Lillian to the core. It had been years since her father had called her Lily, not since before she'd become a young lady and he'd begun to see her as an asset to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished. Without another word, Harold strode from the cabin, Wilson hurrying after him. The sound of hoofbeats faded down the path as the men rode away, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Emma began to fuss, sensing the tension in the room. Lillian bounced her gently, murmuring soothing words, though her own thoughts were in turmoil. "You should go," Isaac said quietly after a long moment, still standing by the door, his expression unreadable. "Your mother is asking for you. That means something." Lillian looked up at him, searching his face. "And if I don't want to go, if I want to stay here?" Something flickered in his gray eyes, hope, perhaps, or fear. "This isn't about what I want, Lillian. This is about what's best for you and Emma." "And what do you think that is?" she pressed, needing to hear him say it, needing some indication of what he truly felt. But Isaac was not a man who revealed his heart easily. "I think you need to see your mother while you still can. Beyond that—" He shrugged, a gesture meant to appear casual but which Lillian recognized as deeply conflicted. "The Milford house is a good property. Solid. Better for a growing child than a one-room cabin." Disappointment washed over Lillian, though she tried not to let it show. Had she misread him so completely? Had these months of shared meals and quiet evenings, of watching him hold Emma with such tenderness, meant nothing more to him than fulfilling some obligation of kindness? "I see," she said, rising from the rocking chair. "Then I suppose I should start packing." Isaac nodded stiffly and turned toward the door. "I'll check on the cattle. Give you some privacy." As the door closed behind him, Lillian sank back into the chair, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Emma reached up to pat her face curiously, and Lillian caught the tiny hand, pressing a kiss to the palm. "What should we do, little one?" she whispered. "Where is our home truly meant to be?" The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Colorado summer day. Lillian had slept little, her mind churning with the decision before her. By first light, she had packed their meager possessions into the same carpet bag she'd left Silver Creek with months before. It seemed both fitting and terribly sad that all their worldly goods still fit into that single bag. Isaac was already up when she emerged from the bedroom area, coffee brewing on the stove and a simple breakfast of biscuits and honey laid out on the table. He looked as if he had slept as poorly as she had, his eyes shadowed, his normally neat hair disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. "Morning," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Coffee's hot." "Thank you," Lillian replied, settling Emma in her cradle before taking a seat at the table. "For the coffee, and for everything else." Isaac nodded but didn't meet her eyes as he poured her a cup. "Your father will likely be here by noon, I thought. I might ride with you to town. Help with your things." The thought of a final ride together, of postponing their goodbye for even a few more hours, was both sweet and painful. "I'd like that." They ate in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. When the meal was finished, Isaac cleared the table with methodical movements, his back to her as he spoke. "Lillian, I want you to know." He paused, seeming to struggle for words, which was unusual for a man who, while not talkative, always spoke with careful precision. "I want you to know that you and Emma always have a place here. If things don't work out in Silver Creek, or if you ever need anything at all." It wasn't what she wanted to hear, not really, but it was something. "Thank you, Isaac. That means a great deal." He turned then, finally meeting her gaze, and the emotion she saw in his eyes nearly took her breath away. There was sadness there, yes, but also a longing so powerful it seemed to fill the space between them. "Lillian," whatever he had been about to say was cut off by the sound of approaching horses, not from the direction of town, but from the ridge trail. Isaac frowned, moving to the window. Riders coming, 3 of them moving fast. Alarm shot through Lillian as she rose to join him at the window. "Not my father. No, don't recognize them." Isaac's expression had shifted, a wariness entering his eyes that Lillian had never seen before. "Stay inside with Emma. I'll see what they want." Before she could protest, he had grabbed his hat and was out the door, leaving Lillian to watch anxiously through the window as he strode toward the approaching riders, his posture alert but not overtly hostile. The men who reined in before him were rough-looking, trail-worn in a way that spoke of long days in the saddle and few comforts. The leader, a tall man with an unkempt beard and a scar that puckered the skin around his left eye, leaned forward in his saddle, saying something to Isaac that Lillian couldn't hear. Whatever it was, Isaac's response was clearly negative, his head shaking firmly. The bearded man laughed, a sound that carried to the cabin harsh and mocking. He gestured toward the cattle visible in the distant pasture, then toward the cabin itself. A chill ran down Lillian's spine. These weren't casual visitors or lost travelers. They wanted something, and from the tension evident in Isaac's stance, it wasn't something he was willing to give. The conversation, if it could be called that, continued for several more minutes, growing visibly more heated. The bearded man's voice rose, carrying snatches of words to the cabin. "Owe us." And, one way or another, Isaac's hand had drifted to his hip, where Lillian knew he kept a revolver when working with the herd. The gesture wasn't lost on the riders, who exchanged glances before the leader spat on the ground at Isaac's feet. With a final word that made Isaac's shoulders stiffen, the riders wheeled their horses around and galloped away, kicking up dust as they vanished over the ridge. Lillian waited until Isaac turned back toward the cabin before opening the door. Emma balanced on her hip. Who were they? Isaac's expression was grim as he removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. Trouble, the Mitchell brothers and their cousin, cattle rustlers and worse, according to what I've heard in town. What did they want? To buy my herd for a fraction of what it's worth, Isaac replied, his jaw tight. When I refused, they suggested I might reconsider after thinking about how isolated we are out here. Fear clutched at Lillian's heart. They threatened you, us, not in so many words. But the message was clear enough. Isaac's eyes held hers, serious but also reassuring. Don't worry, they're mostly talk, and they'll think twice about coming back once they realize I'm not alone out here. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Lillian. By tomorrow, he would be alone again, just as he had been before she and Emma had stumbled into his life. Perhaps it's for the best that Emma and I are leaving, she said softly. One less thing for you to worry about. Something like pain flashed across Isaac's face. You and Emma were never a worry, Lillian, never a burden. He took a step toward her, then stopped as if holding himself back. You were, you are. A cloud of dust on the horizon interrupted him once more, this time from the direction of town. Lillian's heart sank as she recognized her father's buggy approaching, earlier than expected. He's here, she said unnecessarily, disappointment a bitter taste in her mouth. It seemed the universe itself was conspiring to prevent Isaac from finishing whatever he had been trying to tell her. Isaac nodded, his expression closing off once more. I'll get your bag. By the time Harold Davidson pulled up in front of the cabin, Lillian and Isaac were waiting outside, her carpet bag at her feet and Emma bundled in her arms. The sight of her father alone in the buggy surprised Lillian. Where's Mr. Wilson? She asked as Harold climbed down. Attending to your mother, Harold replied, his usual gruffness tempered by what looked like genuine concern. Her condition has worsened overnight, the doctor says. He says we must prepare for the worst. Despite everything, Lillian felt a pang of grief for the mother who had rejected her. Then we should hurry. Harold's eyes moved to Isaac, standing silently beside Lillian. I assume you've said your goodbyes to your host. Before either could respond, the sound of galloping hooves drew their attention once more to the ridge trail. A cloud of dust revealed a single rider approaching at breakneck speed. Isaac stepped forward, placing himself protectively in front of Lillian and Emma as the rider came into view, a young man, barely more than a boy, his face flushed with exertion as he reined in his lathered horse. Mr. Zimmerman, the boy called, his voice cracking with urgency. You gotta come quick. The Mitchell gang there at your south pasture running off your cattle. Isaac's expression hardened. How many? All 3 brothers and their cousin, the boy replied, still trying to catch his breath. And they got 2 more men with them I didn't recognize. Harold Davidson stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Mitchell? You mean Ezra Mitchell, the rustler? You know him? Isaac asked sharply. Harold's expression was grim. The man's a menace. He and his brothers have been terrorizing ranchers up and down the territory for years. No one's been able to catch them in the act. Isaac turned to the boy. Ride to town. Get the sheriff. Tell him what you saw. The boy nodded and wheeled his horse around, spurring it back toward Silver Creek. Isaac turned to Lillian, his expression torn between duty and something deeper. I have to go, he said simply. I know, she replied, fear for him clutching at her heart. But 6 against 1, Isaac, it's suicide. I won't engage them directly, he promised. Just try to slow them down until the sheriff arrives. Harold cleared his throat. I was a fair shot in my younger days, still am when the occasion calls for it. He turned to his buggy and pulled out a rifle from beneath the seat. I could ride with you, Zimmerman, even the odds a bit. The offer clearly surprised both Isaac and Lillian. Harold Davidson had never been known for putting himself at risk for others, especially not a stranger. Isaac studied the older man for a moment, then gave a short nod. "I'd be grateful for the help, Mr. Davidson." Harold turned to Lillian. "Get in the buggy. Drive yourself and the child to town. Go straight to our house. Alina will want to see you right away." "No," Lillian said firmly, surprising herself as much as the men. "I'm not leaving, not like this." "Lillian," Isaac began, his voice gentle but urgent, "this isn't safe for you or Emma." "And I'm not asking to ride with you after the rustlers," she countered. "But I won't leave without knowing if you're coming back. Both of you," she added, glancing at her father. Harold looked as if he wanted to argue but seemed to recognize the determination in his daughter's face, a determination she had inherited from him. "The cabin, then. Stay inside with the doors locked until we return." Lillian nodded, relief washing over her. "Be careful, please." Isaac held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, in a move that surprised them both, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll come back," he promised softly. "Wait for me." With that, he and Harold mounted their horses, Isaac on his stallion. Harold on the spare mount Isaac kept for ranch work, and rode off toward the south pasture, leaving Lillian standing in the yard. Emma clutched close to her heart. The hours that followed were among the most agonizing of Lillian's life. She paced the cabin, alternating between watching out the window for any sign of returning riders and trying to keep Emma entertained. The baby, sensing her mother's anxiety, was fussier than usual, only settling when Lillian sang the lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. The irony wasn't lost on her that, on the very day she was to return to Silver Creek to reconcile with her dying mother, she might lose the man who had become more important to her than she had ever admitted to herself. It was late afternoon when she finally heard the sound of approaching horses. Heart in her throat, she moved to the window, Emma balanced on her hip. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, Isaac, his father, and between them, a third man slumped forward in the saddle, his hands bound to the pommel. As they drew closer, Lillian could see that Isaac's shirt was torn and bloodied on one side, while her father sported a rapidly darkening bruise along his jawline. Setting Emma carefully in her cradle, Lillian rushed outside, her heart pounding with fear and relief. "Isaac, father. Are you all right?" Isaac dismounted with a grimace that told her he was injured more severely than he wanted to admit. "We're fine. Got one of the Mitchells, Ezra himself." The others scattered when they heard the sheriff's posse coming up the valley. Harold helped the bound man down from his horse none too gently. Ezra Mitchell was a sorry sight, his beard matted with blood from a split lip, his left eye swollen shut, and a bullet wound visible through his torn pants leg. "We'll hold him in the root cellar until the sheriff arrives," Isaac decided, gesturing toward the small outbuilding behind the cabin. "He won't be running anywhere on that leg." As Harold marched their prisoner toward the cellar, Lillian stepped closer to Isaac, her eyes fixed on the bloodstain spreading across his shirt. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he insisted, though his pallor and the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "Just a graze." "Inside," Lillian ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Now, let me look at it." Too exhausted to protest further, Isaac allowed her to lead him into the cabin and guide him to a chair. With gentle but efficient movements, she helped him remove his shirt, revealing a deep gash along his ribs where a bullet had carved a furrow through his flesh. "This needs stitching," she said, trying to keep her voice steady at the sight of so much blood. "And cleaning, before infection sets in." Isaac nodded tiredly, his normally alert eyes dulled with pain. There's a medical kit in the trunk by the bed. My sister was a healer of sorts, taught me the basics before she passed. Working quickly, Lillian gathered what she needed: clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey for disinfection, needle and thread. By the time Harold returned from securing their prisoner, she had cleaned the wound and was preparing to stitch it. Harold assessed the situation with a critical eye. "That's going to leave a scar, Zimmerman." "Not my first," Isaac replied with a ghost of a smile. "Probably won't be my last." "It will be if you keep charging headlong at armed rustlers," Lillian muttered, her hands steadier than she felt as she threaded the needle. The stitching was a painful process, but Isaac bore it stoically, his only reaction an occasional sharp intake of breath when the needle hit a particularly sensitive spot. Lillian worked with focused precision, channeling her worry and fear into the task at hand. "You have a steady hand," Harold observed, watching from across the room where he was keeping an eye on Emma. "Your mother would be proud. She always said you had the makings of a fine nurse." The comment, so unexpected and matter-of-fact, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Did she really say that? Harold nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "She said a lot of things about you after you left, most of them regretful." Lillian tied off the final stitch and began bandaging Isaac's torso, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. "I should have been there today, with her." "You'll be there tomorrow," Harold said firmly. "As soon as the sheriff arrives to take Mitchell off our hands, we'll head to town." Isaac, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "You should go now, Mr. Davidson. Take Lillian and Emma with you. Your wife needs her daughter." Harold shook his head. "And leave you alone with a Mitchell brother on your property? That's asking for trouble, especially with you injured. The other brothers will be looking for revenge as soon as they regroup." "I can handle myself," Isaac insisted, "like you handled yourself today." Lillian asked sharply, fear making her voice harsher than intended. "If Father hadn't been with you, you might be dead now." Isaac couldn't argue with that. It had been Harold's warning shout that had alerted him to Ezra Mitchell taking aim from behind a rock, giving him just enough time to dodge what would have been a killing shot. "The sheriff should be here by morning," Harold said decisively. "We'll all leave then. I'll send word to Alina that we've been delayed, but that you're coming." The decision made, they settled in to wait. Harold took the first watch over their prisoner while Lillian prepared a simple meal from the supplies on hand. Isaac, despite his protests, was persuaded to rest, the blood loss and exertion of the day taking their toll. As evening fell, Harold returned to the cabin, reporting that Mitchell was secure but needed medical attention for his leg wound. Lillian, after ensuring Isaac was sleeping comfortably, took her medical supplies to the root cellar. Ezra Mitchell glared at her with his one good eye as she entered, but the fight seemed to have gone out of him. He submitted to her ministrations in sullen silence, only speaking once as she bandaged his leg. "You the cowboy's woman?" Lillian paused, considering the question. "I'm a friend," she said finally. Mitchell snorted. "Some friend, way he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." The rustler's observation sent a flutter through Lillian's chest. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," Mitchell conceded with a shrug. "But a man doesn't fight like that, take a bullet like that for just anybody, not unless they mean something to him." Lillian finished the bandaging and left without responding, the man's words echoing in her mind as she returned to the cabin. Inside, she found Harold seated at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands, his expression thoughtful as he watched Emma sleeping in her cradle. "She looks like you did at that age," he said as Lillian joined him. "Same chin, same determination in her eyes even when she's asleep." Lillian smiled softly. "Mother always said I was stubborn from the moment I was born." "You were," Harold agreed, something like fondness in his voice. Never did anything by halves, my Lily. The use of her childhood nickname again brought a lump to her throat. Why now, father? After all these months of silence, why come looking for me now? Harold sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. Because your mother made me promise. Because she's dying with regrets that are eating her alive. And because... He hesitated, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I have regrets of my own. Lillian waited, hardly daring to breathe as her father gathered his thoughts. I was wrong, he said finally, the admission clearly difficult for a man who had built his life on being right. I was wrong to cast you out when you needed us most, wrong to let pride and appearances matter more than my own child's welfare. He glanced toward Isaac, still sleeping near the fire. And I was wrong about your friend. He's a good man, better than most. Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, years of hurt and rejection beginning to heal with those simple words. Thank you, father. Harold reached across the table, awkwardly patting her hand. I can't change what's done. But I can try to make things right going forward. For you, for Emma, and for your mother while she still has time. They sat in silence for a while, the first comfortable silence between them in years. Finally, Harold rose, stretching his back with a grimace. I'll take the next watch on Mitchell. You should rest. After her father had gone, Lillian moved to check on Isaac, who was still sleeping, his breathing even. In repose, his face looked younger, the lines of care and responsibility smoothed away. Without thinking, she reached out to brush a lock of dark hair from his forehead. His eyes opened at her touch, gray and clear despite the pain and blood loss. Lillian, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. I'm here, she assured him, her hand lingering against his cheek. How do you feel? Like I got shot, he replied with a hint of his dry humor. But better for seeing you. Her heart swelled at his words. You should rest more. In a minute, he said, reaching up to capture her hand in his. I need to say something first. Lillian held her breath, remembering the interrupted moments from earlier in the day. I'm listening. Isaac's eyes held her steadily, all his usual reserve gone. I don't want you to go. I know you need to see your mother and I would never ask you not to go to her, but after you've done what you need to do in town, I want you to come back, here, to me. Joy bloomed in Lillian's chest, warming her from within. Isaac, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not good with words, Lillian, never have been. But these past months with you and Emma, they've been the best of my life. This cabin was just a shelter before you came, you made it a home. He squeezed her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. I love you, Lillian Davidson. You and Emma both. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life making you both happy. Tears of happiness spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. We love you too, Isaac, so much. And yes, we'll come back. This is our home, you are our home. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle, but filled with promise, the promise of a future together. Of a love that had grown slowly and surely over shared meals and quiet evenings, over the care of a child and the building of a life. When they finally parted, Isaac smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed his face and made Lillian's heart skip a beat. I'll speak to your father tomorrow. Do things properly. Lillian laughed softly. I think he might surprise you. He already told me he was wrong about you. Said you were a good man, better than most. High praise from Harold Davidson, Isaac murmured, his eyes already growing heavy again as exhaustion reclaimed him. But the only opinion that matters to me is yours. Sleep now, Lillian urged, pressing a final kiss to his forehead. I'll be here when you wake. The sheriff and his posse arrived just after dawn, taking custody of Ezra Mitchell and promising to keep watch for his brothers, who had fled toward the territorial border. Harold, satisfied that Isaac would be safe, prepared to take Lillian and Emma to Silver Creek to see Alina. "We'll be back in a few days," Lillian promised as she said goodbye to Isaac on the porch, Emma gurgling happily in her arms. As soon as things are settled with Mother." Isaac nodded, understanding the unspoken reality that Alina Davidson might not have long. Though still weak from his wound, he stood tall and straight as he bid them farewell. "I'll be waiting," he said simply. "This is your home, Lillian. It always will be." The journey to Silver Creek was quiet, Harold seemingly lost in his own thoughts as he drove the buggy. As they crested the final hill and the town came into view, Lillian felt a strange mix of emotions: nostalgia for the place she had grown up, anxiety about the reception she would receive, and grief for the mother she was about to lose. The Davidson house stood as it always had, grand and imposing at the end of Main Street. But as they approached, Lillian noticed subtle changes: the gardens less meticulously kept, the paint on the shutters beginning to fade. Like her father, the house seemed to have aged in her absence. Dr. Patterson met them at the door, his expression grave. "She's been asking for you, Miss Davidson. She's very weak, but still lucid." Heart pounding, Lillian followed the doctor upstairs to her parents' bedroom, Emma quiet in her arms as if sensing the solemnity of the moment. The room was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn against the morning sun. In the massive four-poster bed that had always made her mother look small, Alina Davidson now appeared almost childlike, her once plump frame wasted by disease. "Mother," Lillian said softly, approaching the bedside. Alina's eyes, sunken but still bright, fluttered open. For a moment confusion crossed her face, then recognition dawned, followed by a joy so pure it transformed her wasted features. "Lily," she breathed, reaching out a trembling hand. "You came." "Of course I came," Lillian replied, taking her mother's hand and pressing it to her cheek. "I'm sorry it took so long." Alina's gaze moved to Emma, who was studying her great-grandmother with solemn curiosity. "And this is Emma," Lillian said, shifting the baby so Alina could see her better. "Your granddaughter." Tears filled Alina's eyes as she lifted a frail hand to touch Emma's cheek. "She's beautiful, Lily, perfect. I was such a fool." "Shh," Lillian soothed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "None of that matters now, we're here." For the next 2 days, Lillian barely left her mother's side. They talked for hours when Alina had the strength about the past, about the mistakes made on both sides, about forgiveness and second chances. Harold joined them often, and Lillian witnessed a tenderness between her parents that she hadn't seen since her childhood. On the 3rd day, Alina asked to speak with Lillian alone. Her voice was weaker now, each word an effort, but her eyes were clear and purposeful. "Your father tells me about the cowboy," she said, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Says he's a good man who loves you." Lillian nodded, warmth spreading through her at the thought of Isaac. He does. "And you love him." "With all my heart," Lillian admitted. "He took us in when we had nowhere else to go. He gave us a home without asking a single question about our past or placing a single condition on his kindness." Alina squeezed her daughter's hand with surprising strength. "Then that's where you belong, my darling, with him." "But Father wants us to stay in Silver Creek," Lillian said uncertainly. "He's prepared the Milford house for us." "Your father means well," Alina replied, her breath coming in shallow gasps now. "But he doesn't always know what's best for the heart. I've asked him to give you his blessing. To return to your cowboy, after I'm gone." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "And did he agree?" A spark of the old Alina, the strong-willed woman who had ruled Silver Creek society for decades, flashed in her eyes. "He will." "I may be dying, Lily, but I can still bend that stubborn man to my will when it matters most." They both laughed, and for a moment, it was as if the estrangement had never happened, just a mother and daughter sharing a private joke about the man they both loved. Aliner's expression grew serious again. "Promise me something, Lily." "Anything, Mother. Be happy," Aliner said simply. "Don't let pride or fear or what others might think stand in the way of your happiness. I did for too long. Don't make my mistakes." "I promise," Lillian whispered, pressing a kiss to her mother's papery cheek. Aliner Davidson passed peacefully in her sleep that night, with Harold holding one hand and Lillian the other. There were tears, of course, but also a sense of completion, of wrongs righted and peace made before it was too late. The funeral was held 2 days later, attended by most of Silver Creek. Lillian stood beside her father at the graveside, Emma in her arms, aware of the whispers and stares but no longer caring what anyone thought. The opinions that mattered were those of the people who truly loved her father, who was learning to show his love again, her daughter, who loved freely and without judgment, and Isaac, who had sent a beautiful arrangement of wildflowers with a note that simply read, "Come home when you're ready. We're waiting for you." It was a week after the funeral when Harold Davidson finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. They were sitting in the parlor of the Davidson house, Emma playing on a blanket at their feet. "The Milford house is ready," he said, watching Lillian carefully. "It's yours whenever you want it, a proper home for you and Emma." Lillian took a deep breath. "Father, I'm grateful for the offer, truly, but my home is with Isaac now." To her surprise, Harold nodded slowly. "I know, your mother made me promise to respect your choice. And after seeing how that man fought to protect what's his, how he looks at you and the little one, well, I'd be a fool to stand in your way." Relief washed over Lillian. "Thank you, Father." "But," Harold continued, raising a finger, "I have conditions." Lillian tensed. "What conditions?" "First, you'll marry the man properly. No granddaughter of mine is going to live in sin with a cowboy, no matter how decent he might be." A smile tugged at Lillian's lips. "I believe that's between Isaac and me, but I assure you he's already spoken of marriage." Harold harumphed, but there was no real displeasure in it. "Second, you'll allow me to help him expand that ranch of his. I have connections with the cattle buyers in Denver who could prove useful." "That's very generous, Father, but Isaac is proud. He may not accept." "He will if he's smart," Harold replied matter-of-factly. "It's not charity, it's an investment in my granddaughter's future. And third," his voice softened slightly, "you'll bring Emma to visit her grandfather regularly. This house is too empty now without your mother." I need the sound of children in it again. Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes as she reached out to take her father's hand. "That I can promise without reservation. Emma should know her grandfather." 2 days later, a wagon pulled up in front of the Davidson house. Lillian, watching from the window, felt her heart leap at the sight of Isaac climbing down, looking much recovered from his wound and more handsome than ever in a clean shirt and his best denims. Harold met him at the door, and Lillian hung back in the hallway, allowing the two men a moment alone. She couldn't hear what was said, but when she finally joined them, both looked satisfied, and Isaac's eyes held a light she hadn't seen before. "Ready to go home?" he asked, holding out his hand to her. Lillian placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and surety of his grip. "More than ready." The journey back to the ranch was filled with plans and dreams. Isaac spoke of the house he wanted to build on the ridge, 4 bedrooms. He insisted, for the family they would have together. Lillian shared her father's offer of business connections, relieved when Isaac accepted graciously, recognizing the gesture for what it was, an olive branch, and a father's way of ensuring his daughter and granddaughter would be provided for. As they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, nestled against the backdrop of mountains and open sky, Lillian felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. This place that had once been merely a refuge in her time of greatest need had become the home of her heart. Isaac drew the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin and turned to her, his gray eyes serious. "I have something to ask you properly, Lillian Davidson." Her heart quickened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond at its center. "It was my mother's," he explained, a touch of nervousness in his voice that she found endearing. "I rode into Denver yesterday to have it sized for you." "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, touched by the sentiment behind the gift. Isaac took her hand, his gaze never leaving hers. "Lillian, when you came into my life, I was existing but not really living. You and Emma brought light and purpose back to me. I love you both more than I ever thought possible." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Will you marry me, Lillian? Make this place truly a home with me?" "Yes," Lillian replied without hesitation, her heart so full it might burst. 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma, who had been watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, let out a delighted gurgle, reaching for Isaac with her chubby hands. He laughed, lifting her high before settling her against his chest. "I think she approves," he said, his smile warming Lillian from within. "She's a very smart girl," Lillian replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. "She knows her daddy when she sees him." The look of stunned joy on Isaac's face at those words was something Lillian knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Without speaking, he drew both of them into an embrace, his strength and warmth enveloping them in a promise of protection and love. "Welcome home," he whispered against her hair, "both of you." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the land and held in the arms of the man she loved, Lillian knew that she had found what she had been searching for all her life, not the conditional acceptance of Silver Creek society, not even the reconciliation with her family, precious as that was, but the unconditional love and belonging that only comes when someone looks at you with all your flaws and failures and still calls you home without a question. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony on the ridge where Isaac planned to build their new house. Harold Davidson stood proudly as Lillian's witness, while Mrs. Abernathy, who had provided that first crucial help when Lillian needed it most, held Emma throughout the service. The town of Silver Creek was divided in its reaction to the marriage, some approving of the redemption of Harold Davidson's fallen daughter, others still clinging to their judgment and disapproval. But Lillian and Isaac were beyond caring about the opinions of those who had turned their backs when it mattered most. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. The house on the ridge was completed before the first snow fell. A sturdy, beautiful home with large windows that captured the magnificent views in every direction. Isaac's cattle herd grew, thanks in part to Harold's business connections, and the ranch prospered. Emma took her first steps in the garden Lillian planted behind the new house, toddling unsteadily toward Isaac, who waited with outstretched arms and a heart full of pride for the daughter who shared none of his blood but all of his love. And when, a year after their wedding, Lillian placed Isaac's hand on her gently rounded belly, the joy in his eyes told her that the family they were building together was the greatest treasure either of them could have imagined. "Another little one to love," he whispered in awe, drawing her close. "Another little one to call this place home," Lillian agreed, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside their window, the Colorado sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, a daily reminder of the beauty that could be found even after the darkest storms. And in the warmth of their embrace, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world, not defined by the mistakes of her past or the judgments of others, but by the love that had welcomed her without question and called her home.